Investigators thought this shredded computer disk held important information about a murder. The most sophisticated and islands. Residents say you can hide in these islands and never be found. But living there had its challenges.
They got mosquitoes the size of dogs there. I mean, just huge. You see spiders that are as big as your head, and I mean, you just see weird stuff that you've never seen before.
Josh Snodgrass grew up in the Philippines. His father, Joe, was a U.S. military officer at Clark Air Force Base near Manila. His mother, Julie, was from Mississippi and had trouble adjusting to life overseas.
The nicest woman you could have ever met. There wasn't a bad bone in her body.
Julie, as warm as she was to the American community, she wasn't crazy about the Philippines. There were some people, probably not surprising, that didn't like the Philippines.
On February 25, 1991, Joe Snodgrass called police to report his wife missing. He said they had an argument.
He says, I thought she was going to go cool off. Okay, this sort of thing has happened before, okay, when she storms out.
Military records showed that Julie left the military base around 10:30 p.m. But this time, she never came back. At 4 a.m. the next morning, a cab driver found Julie seated in her truck on a deserted dirt road, 2 miles from them. Unfortunately, there were no fingerprints.
Why was this truck sitting in the middle of the night on a dirt road in a restricted area where no service member would go and certainly no wife would go? Very, it caused a lot of folks to scratch a lot of heads here.
Julie Snodgrass was just 33 years old. Josh recalls his father's reaction when he heard the news.
What I remember is seeing him shaking. Something my dad never did, but I can only equate it to someone advanced Parkinson's, and just shaking out of control.
Joe Snodgrass never left the military base that night, so he was not considered a suspect. But who wanted to harm his wife?
And she started changing her story.
I think there was a total of 3 more interviews, possibly 4, that were done with Lucy. And through each one, we began to drill through inconsistencies.
In a remarkable turnaround, Lucy changed her story. She now admitted taking part in Julie's murder.
She described how Joe came to her, explained to her that he wanted his wife dead, that he couldn't live with his wife anymore and wanted her out of the way.
Lucy said she hired her 2 uncles to carry out the murder, and they in turn hired a 3rd man to help them.
And so the story she told subsequently was devastating. But see, that's not the end of everything, because, well, hold it, when was she lying? Was she lying the first time or the second time?
When confronted with Lucy's confession, Joe Snodgrass angrily denied any involvement in the murder of his wife, and he called his former housekeeper a liar. To prove it, he permitted investigators to search his house.
He consented, a consent search, okay? He didn't have to. They could have gone and tried to get a search warrant, but they didn't have to. He consented. They found these insurance policies under a mattress. And they said, man, what are these insurance in the mattress? And he said to them, well, I really didn't want you to find those. A little suspicious looking. I didn't want you to find that.
The policies revealed something troubling. Joe had recently increased the amount of his wife's life insurance from $200,000 to over $400,000. And on Joe's desk at work, investigators found even more potential evidence.
They came up with a bunch of floppy disks, those big 5 1/4 disks that we used to use.
But just as the investigation was starting to take shape, Joe's colleagues in the Office of Special Investigations made a catastrophic blunder, one that threatened the entire case.
It's a crazy story, and something that you cannot imagine happening.
The emotion was just incredible. It was a gut-wrenching, a sickening feeling. There are pieces of this disc on the floor. Now, I'll tell you, a couple of things go through your mind at this point. The first thing is, how in the world did this man get scissors into the inner room? And second of all, how did he get the disc and do this?
Apparently, Snodgrass knew investigators had his floppy disks, and he came to the interrogation prepared.
We knew that whatever was on that disc was absolutely, should I say, death to Joe.
Joe Snodgrass was immediately taken into military custody.
He called us up and said, they are arresting me for the murder of your mother. And he said, I promise, I did not kill your mother. And I said, okay, I believe you.
Investigators were desperate to repair not only the discs, but the damage to their reputations as well. To their enormous relief, it was a success.
It took some initiative, and it worked. Ha!
There were lots of cheers, so it was pretty cool. It was pretty rewarding that we were actually developed a technique that was working, and we were actually getting data.
And my reaction was, Jim, I love you, man. I love you. I can't believe this. Of course, you got to ask the obvious questions. You're not joking, right?
What some said would cost close to $1 million had only cost $131.
And that included the $50 for the first disk drive that we destroyed.
But was there any information on the discs that would implicate Sergeant Joe Snodgrass in his wife's murder? Thanks to the efforts of the U.S. military's Computer Forensics Lab, investigators were finally able to read what was on the floppy disks. Who was behind it?
While she was being stabbed to death, Julie Snodgrass cried out in English, "I hate you, Joe. I hate you, Joe."
The circumstances even more vile than if he had taken the knife himself and killed her. The manipulation that took place, the planning that took place.
Apparently, Lucy believed that Joe would marry her and take her to the United States when his tour of duty was over. They would have lived comfortably on the $400,000 from Julie's life insurance.
Violence. Violence is what happens whenever people go nuts, so.
Sergeant Joe Snodgrass was sentenced to life in a military prison without parole. Lucy was convicted by a Philippine court and sentenced to only 1 year in prison. Her two uncles served similar sentences. The third man involved in the murder has never been found.
This was the first case where digital evidence and the term forensics were put in the same sentence. Computer crime investigation was not a forensics discipline until we put these diskettes back together.
Our cyber guys broke ground. They blazed a new path, a new trail in the field of forensics. They really did.
This case not only made forensic history, it changed security protocols around the world. No longer was cutting a disk in two enough.
The implications of our technique was that for $131, and not a whole lot of brain cells, we can retrieve that data. Anybody can do this. And now everybody has to change their protocol on how to safeguard classified information.